The dispatcher looked at me for a long moment before sliding the paperwork across the counter. "Before you sign," he said quietly, "go outside and take a look at what you're pulling tonight." I smiled to myself. After enough years on the road, I'd hauled just about everything that could fit on a trailer. Steel coils, wind turbine blades, farm equipment, even a small historic locomotive once. So I figured this would be another oversized load. A little wider, a little heavier, maybe another escort vehicle or two. I was wrong. The moment I stepped outside, I stopped walking. Not because I wanted to, because my brain needed a second to understand what I was looking at. The trailer stretched across nearly the entire loading yard. Marker lights glowed all along its sides like a string of amber stars. The rear seemed so far away it almost disappeared into the darkness. And resting on top was the largest single piece of machinery I'd ever seen. Even from a distance, it looked enormous. Its curved steel frame caught the yellow light from the yard lamps. Massive chains disappeared over its sides. Thick straps crossed it from every direction. It didn't resemble ordinary cargo. It looked more like part of a building, or something taken from the middle of a factory. I slowly walked toward it. Each step made it seem even larger. A man wearing a reflective jacket noticed the expression on my face. He chuckled softly. Gets that reaction every time. "What is it?" I asked. He looked up at the load before answering. "A hydroelectric turbine housing." I nodded, though the truth was, I still had no idea what I was looking at. He smiled. "It'll help make electricity someday." That somehow made it even more impressive. The steel looked almost alive beneath the floodlights. Smooth in some places, rough in others, covered with markings from the machine shop where it had been built. The trailer beneath it was unlike any I'd hauled before. Dozens of wheels, hydraulic suspension, axles that could turn independently. Everything about it had been designed for one purpose: moving something that barely wanted to be moved. The paperwork listed the weight. I read the number twice, then a third time. It wasn't the heaviest load I'd ever seen, but combined with its size, it demanded respect. Oversized loads aren't about speed. They're about patience. Every bridge matters. Every corner matters. Every mile requires attention. There would be escort vehicles in front, another behind, special permits for every state. Some roads would close briefly as we passed. Others had already been inspected days before. It takes weeks of planning for a trip that might only last a few nights. Standing beside that enormous trailer, I realized something. This wasn't just another delivery. For the next several hundred miles, every decision would have to be made a little more carefully. A mechanic climbed down from beneath the trailer. He wiped his hands on a rag and nodded toward my truck. "She's ready whenever you are." I glanced back at my Peterbilt. Compared to the load, it suddenly looked much smaller than usual. Its amber marker lights reflected softly across the wet pavement. The chrome bumper caught the glow from the loading yard. Steam drifted lazily from the exhaust into the cool night air. I've always liked that moment before a long trip. The paperwork is signed. The route is planned. The coffee is still hot. And the road is waiting. I climbed into the cab, closed the heavy door behind me. Instantly, the sounds outside became quieter. The familiar hum of the heater replaced the voices in the yard. The cab felt like home. My travel mug rested in the cup holder. The CB radio crackled softly. Maps lay folded neatly beside the passenger seat. Some things change with every trip. Others never do. I turned the key. The diesel engine came to life with its deep, familiar rumble. That sound has always had a calming effect on me. Not loud, Not aggressive, just steady, reliable, comforting. Outside, workers performed one final inspection. Flashlights moved slowly around the trailer. Chains were checked once more. Pins were examined. Hydraulic lines inspected. Nobody rushed. Oversized hauling teaches patience before the truck even starts moving. Several minutes later, my escort driver climbed onto the running board and tapped lightly on the window. "You ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be." He grinned. "Good." He pointed toward the massive load behind me. "Because people are going to remember seeing this one." I looked into the mirrors. The turbine housing filled nearly everything behind the cab. Rows of amber marker lights stretched into the darkness. For a brief moment, it looked less like a trailer and more like an entire building following behind me. The gate slowly opened. The escort truck rolled ahead, its yellow warning lights beginning their steady rhythm. I eased the Peterbilt into gear. The trailer responded with surprising smoothness. Hundreds of tons of carefully engineered steel began moving almost silently through the night. We left the lights of the industrial yard behind. Ahead of us lay hundreds of miles of quiet American highways. Small towns still asleep. Long bridges, mountain grades, empty deserts, countless gentle curves waiting beneath the stars. At that moment, I had no idea that the hardest part of the trip wouldn't be the weight. It wouldn't be the mountains, and it wouldn't be the narrow roads. The real challenge was something no permit, no map, and no escort driver could have prepared us for, and it was already waiting somewhere ahead. The highway welcomed us with surprising silence. The city lights faded behind us, leaving only the steady glow of marker lights stretching into the darkness. Our convoy settled into an easy rhythm. The escort truck led the way. My Peterbilt followed. Behind me, the enormous trailer rolled as smoothly as a slow-moving river. Oversized hauling is different from ordinary trucking. You don't simply drive. You guide something through the world. Every movement happens a little earlier. Every turn begins a little slower. Every stop is planned long before your foot reaches the brake pedal. Within the first hour, I found myself relaxing into the pace. The engine hummed steadily beneath the cab. The heater filled the interior with comfortable warmth. Outside, the autumn air carried just enough chill to remind me summer was over. The CB radio remained mostly quiet. Only an occasional message from the lead escort interrupted the peaceful rhythm. Clear ahead. Bridge in 2 miles. Traffic light. Simple words. Calm words. The kind you quickly learn to trust. The load behind me never disappeared from my thoughts. Every glance into the mirrors reminded me of its size. Amber lights stretched almost endlessly behind the truck. The steel housing reflected the moonlight whenever the road curved just enough. It almost looked like another vehicle following us, a very large one. People often imagine oversized hauling as exciting. In reality, it's surprisingly peaceful. You travel slower than everyone else. You pay closer attention, and before long, the road begins to slow your thoughts as well. That's one of the things I've always loved about trucking. The highway has a way of quieting the mind. Problems waiting back home seem smaller. Tomorrow feels less important. Only the next mile matters. About midnight, we crossed into open farmland. The road became almost perfectly straight. Fields stretched away on both sides, their edges hidden beneath the darkness. Only distant farmhouse lights hinted that anyone else was awake. My escort driver spoke over the radio. Coffee stop in about 20 miles. Sounds good. One thing oversized drivers learn quickly: you stop whenever the route allows, not whenever you feel like it. Finding parking for a normal tractor trailer can already be difficult. Finding enough room for a convoy nearly 200 feet long takes planning. 20 minutes later, flashing amber lights guided us into a large rest area reserved earlier that evening. Several state transportation trucks were already waiting. One officer climbed from his pickup as I shut down the engine. He smiled. "You're right on schedule." I'll take that as a compliment. It is. The cool night air felt refreshing as I climbed down from the cab. The trailer seemed even larger now that it stood still. Without the movement of the road, its size became almost unbelievable. A young family happened to stop at the rest area while we were there. The little boy noticed the trailer immediately. He tugged excitedly on his father's jacket, pointing toward the enormous piece of steel. His father walked over carefully. "Mind if we take a look?" "Not at all." The boy's eyes grew wider with every step. "Mister," he asked quietly, "is that a spaceship?" I couldn't help smiling. "No, but I can see why you'd think so." He circled the trailer slowly, looking up the entire time. "What is it?" I explained as simply as I could. "It's going to become part of a hydroelectric dam. It'll help make electricity." He thought about that for a moment. "So someday, lights in somebody's house will work because you brought this?" I never thought about it quite that way. I looked back at the enormous steel housing. "I suppose they will." The boy grinned. "That's pretty cool. Children have a way of seeing things adults often forget." To me, it had become another load, another job, another delivery. To him, it was part of something much bigger. Long after the family left, I found myself thinking about that conversation. Sometimes trucking feels repetitive. Pick up, drive, deliver, repeat. But every once in a while, you remember that almost everything around us traveled on a truck first. Bridges, hospitals, wind turbines, factories, machines, even entire homes. Someone had to move them. Someone had to take them where they needed to be. The escort driver returned carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one through my open door. "Long night ahead. The best kind." He laughed. "I've noticed something." "What's that?" "You never seem in a hurry." I looked across the quiet parking area before answering. The highway cured me of that years ago. Hurry usually costs more time than it saves. He nodded slowly. "Especially with something like this. Especially with something like this." A few minutes later, the convoy was moving once again. The tires whispered against the pavement. The amber lights reflected softly across the polished steel. Somewhere ahead, the first mountain pass waited. Not particularly steep, not especially famous, just another climb on another quiet highway. Yet every experienced, oversized driver knows the road always begins asking questions long before sunrise. And tonight, it was about to ask its first one. By the time we reached the foothills, the sky had become perfectly clear. Thousands of stars stretched above the highway. Without city lights, they seemed close enough to touch. The road began climbing almost unnoticed. Not steep, not difficult, just enough for the engine to settle into a deeper rhythm. Oversized loads teach you to listen, not only with your ears, with your hands, your feet, even the seat beneath you. After enough years behind the wheel, you begin to notice the smallest changes. The engine tells you how hard it's working. The steering wheel tells you how the trailer is following. The mirrors tell you everything else. I glanced into them every few seconds. The turbine housing remained perfectly centered. Its countless amber lights glowed quietly against the darkness. The trailer moved almost gracefully. Something so enormous had no business looking that smooth. The escort driver's voice came across the CB. Left curve ahead. I've got it. Take your time. That was advice no truck driver has ever regretted following. The curve wasn't particularly sharp. Still, I eased off the throttle long before we reached it. The Peterbilt leaned gently into the bend. Behind me, dozens of trailer axles followed one after another, almost like a train finding its way around the track. I watched every mirror. The rear wheels stayed exactly where they should. A small correction with the steering wheel. Another gentle movement. Then the road straightened once again. Looking good, the escort driver said. Appreciated. There was something calming about oversized hauling. People often imagine stress, pressure, constant excitement. Most nights, it was simply patience. One careful decision after another. Eventually, we reached the mountain pass. Calling it a mountain almost felt generous. Compared to the Rockies, it was little more than a long hill. Still, weight changes everything. Even a gentle climb asks different questions when you're pulling hundreds of thousands of pounds. The engine settled into a lower gear. Its familiar rumble filled the cab. I rested one hand lightly on the steering wheel, the other wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. Steam drifted slowly upward. Outside, the temperature continued falling. A thin layer of mist hovered over the low valleys. It looked almost like silver water beneath the moonlight. The highway remained nearly empty. Every few minutes another truck appeared. Most drivers slowed slightly as they passed. Some flashed their marker lights. Others gave a friendly wave. Truck drivers understand oversized loads, even if they've never hauled one themselves. They know patience matters, and they know someone is working hard to move something important. Near the summit, the escort called again. There's a scenic overlook about 2 miles ahead. I remember that one. Let's stop there for a quick walk around. Sounds good. A few minutes later, we eased into the overlook. It had been built for tourists, families, travelers, people looking for photographs. Tonight, it belonged only to us. The valley stretched for miles below. Tiny town lights shimmered in the distance. The highway wound through the darkness like a quiet ribbon. The Peterbilt idled softly. The trailer stood motionless behind it. For several moments, nobody spoke. Sometimes silence is the best part of the road. The escort driver eventually climbed down from his truck. He stood beside me at the guardrail. Hard to believe people sleep through views like this. I smiled. They're probably warm in bed. So are we. He replied. I looked at him, confused. He tapped the side of my truck. Cab's warmer than most hotel rooms. I laughed. He wasn't entirely wrong. Truck cabs become little homes. The coffee tastes better there. Rain sounds softer there. Long nights somehow feel shorter there. You begin measuring comfort differently. Not by square footage, by familiar sounds. The heater, the engine, the quiet ticking of cooling metal after shutting down. Home isn't always a place. Sometimes, it's wherever you park for the night. We completed another inspection. Chains remained tight. Hydraulic lines looked perfect. Every tire appeared exactly as it should. Nothing had shifted. The load hadn't moved so much as an inch. Looks like she's happy, the escort driver said. I'd like to keep it that way. Before climbing back into the cab, I looked once more toward the valley. The highway disappeared into the darkness below. Somewhere beyond those hills, our destination waited. Hundreds of miles still remained, yet there was no rush. Oversized freight has its own pace. The road decides how quickly you travel, not the clock. I started the Peterbilt once more. The diesel answered with its deep, comforting rumble. The convoy rolled quietly away from the overlook. Ahead lay a long, gentle descent. one that looked perfectly ordinary on the map. But every experienced heavy-haul driver knows, sometimes the easiest-looking roads demand the most respect. And before the sun came up, this one would quietly remind us why. The descent began so gently that, at first, it hardly felt like a descent at all. The road stretched smoothly ahead, disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of the headlights. Anyone driving a car might not have noticed the grade. A truck driver always does, especially with a load this size. Gravity has a quiet voice. It doesn't shout. It simply asks for a little more attention with every passing mile. Before reaching the crest, I had already selected the gear I wanted. Heavy haul drivers learn early. You choose your gear before the hill, not halfway down. The engine brake settled into its familiar rhythm. A deep mechanical murmur echoed softly through the cab. I barely touched the service brakes. There was no need. Everything was working exactly as planned. The escort driver's voice came over the CB. Looking good back there. Everything feels steady. That's what I like to hear. The convoy continued downward at an easy pace. Slower than the posted speed. Much slower than the cars around us. Most drivers passed patiently. Some slowed just long enough to admire the enormous trailer. Others simply watched as they disappeared into the night ahead. I never minded. Oversized loads teach patience to everyone sharing the road. The mountain air drifted through a tiny crack in the driver's window. Cool, fresh, carrying the faint scent of pine trees. For a while, I simply listened. The engine, the tires, the gentle whistle of the wind around the mirrors. Every truck has its own collection of sounds. After enough years, you know when every one of them is exactly where it should be. The Peterbilt sounded content. The trailer followed faithfully behind. Miles slipped quietly beneath the wheels. Near the middle of the descent, warning signs began appearing beside the highway. Trucks use low gear. A little farther, another sign. 6% grade next 7 miles. I smiled to myself. Signs like these aren't meant to frighten experienced drivers. They're reminders. The mountain simply asks one question. Did you prepare before coming down? If the answer is yes, the hill becomes another peaceful drive. If the answer is no, the mountain will teach the lesson anyway. I had seen those lessons before. Years earlier, an older driver shared something with me over coffee. He pointed toward a long western grade outside the diner window. That hill doesn't care how many years you've been driving. It doesn't care what truck you own. It only cares whether you respect it. I've never forgotten those words. Respect keeps trucks moving. Confidence alone does not. The escort truck slowed slightly. Brake check area coming up. I'll pull in. Large gravel parking areas sat beside the highway every few miles, built specifically for truck inspections. We eased into one of them. The convoy came to a smooth stop. The night remained perfectly still. Steam drifted gently from beneath the Peterbilt's hood. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. I climbed down with my flashlight. Walking around a heavy-haul trailer becomes almost meditative after enough trips. Flashlight across each tire. Check every chain. Touch each binder. Look for anything different. Most inspections take only a few minutes. This one lasted a little longer. Not because anything was wrong, because oversized loads deserve extra attention. The turbine housing stood silently above us. Its curved steel reflected the moonlight. Sometimes I forgot it was cargo. It looked more like part of a monument. The escort driver joined me near the rear axle. Everything's still tight. Looks perfect. He nodded toward one of the tires. You know, Most people driving past have no idea how much planning goes into a trip like this. He was right. They see flashing lights, a slow-moving truck, maybe a brief delay. What they don't see are the weeks before the trip ever begins. Survey crews measuring bridges, engineers checking weight limits, permit offices reviewing routes, escort schedules, police coordination, even utility companies, sometimes lifting power lines for loads too tall to pass underneath. Hundreds of people working together so one piece of machinery can quietly travel across the country. That thought has always fascinated me. Trucking often looks like a solitary job, but every successful delivery depends on dozens of people you'll never meet. Mechanics, dispatchers, bridge inspectors, escort drivers, road crews. Everyone plays a small part. And somehow, the load keeps moving. We climbed back into our trucks. The convoy rolled onto the highway once more. The descent gradually became gentler. The engine brake relaxed. The road opened into a broad valley. Off in the distance, I noticed hundreds of tiny lights shimmering against the horizon. A town, still asleep beneath the stars. Its streets looked peaceful from up here, almost silent. The escort driver spoke again. We'll be passing straight through there. Any tight turns? One. He paused. Very tight. I looked ahead toward the scattered lights. From this distance, everything appeared simple, but experience had taught me something. The most challenging part of an oversized haul isn't usually the open highway. It's the small towns, old intersections, narrow streets, historic bridges, traffic lights that were never designed for loads this large. Somewhere inside that sleeping town, one quiet corner was waiting for us. And before sunrise, it would ask for every inch of patience we had. By the time we reached the edge of town, the eastern sky was still dark. Only the faintest hint of dawn rested somewhere beyond the horizon. The streets were empty. Storefront windows reflected our flashing amber lights. Traffic signals changed patiently for roads with almost no traffic. Small towns always feel different before sunrise. Everything seems quieter, slower, almost as if the whole place is still dreaming. The escort truck rolled ahead, blocking the first intersection. Yellow warning lights painted the pavement with soft reflections. Intersection secured. Came the calm voice over the CB. Proceed when ready. I eased the Peterbilt forward, barely above walking speed. The first turn wasn't difficult. It simply required patience. The trailer followed exactly as planned, its rear axles steering themselves gently around the corner. I watched every mirror, the left side, the right side, then back again. When you're hauling something this large, your mirrors become more important than the windshield. Every inch matters. The escort driver guided me calmly. 2 feet to your right. Looking good. Nice and easy. There was never any shouting, never any panic. The quieter everyone remains, the smoother the job becomes. Soon we reached the center of town. An old brick courthouse stood beneath warm streetlights. A small diner sat on the opposite corner. Its neon sign had just flickered to life. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through my slightly open window. For a brief moment, I forgot I was hauling one of the largest loads of my career. It simply felt like another peaceful morning on the road. A pickup truck stopped at the intersection ahead. The driver waited patiently behind the escort vehicle. Instead of looking annoyed, he climbed out. He removed his cap, folded his arms against the cool morning air, and simply watched. As I slowly rolled past, he smiled and gave a small wave. I answered with 2 quick flashes of the marker lights. Truck drivers understand those little gestures. Sometimes they say more than words. A few blocks later, we reached the tightest turn on the route. It connected the old downtown with a newer state highway. On paper, the turn was possible. In reality, it left almost no extra room. Months before the trip, engineers had measured every curb, every traffic light, every utility pole. Even so, standing there in the darkness, it looked impossibly narrow. The escort driver's voice remained calm. Everything's exactly where we expected. Take all the room you need. I slowed until the truck was barely moving. The steering wheel turned little by little beneath my hands. The Peterbilt entered the intersection. The enormous trailer responded a few seconds later. Watching that much steel move around a corner is almost hypnotic. Nothing happens quickly. The front begins the turn. Then the center follows. Finally, the rear axles quietly complete the movement. It reminded me of watching a river bend around a hillside. Slow, steady, effortless, 1 inch at a time. The escort driver continued guiding me. 6 inches from the curb. Perfect. Keep coming. I hardly breathed. Not from fear, from concentration. The mirrors showed exactly what I needed. The right rear wheels tracked neatly along the edge of the pavement. The left side cleared the traffic signal with room to spare. Another few feet, another gentle correction. Then suddenly, the trailer straightened. We were through. The escort laughed softly over the radio. I don't think you wasted an inch. I wasn't planning to. We both laughed. The hardest turn of the trip now sat quietly behind us. As the convoy left town, the road opened once again. Fields stretched across both sides of the highway. Morning mist hovered low over the grass. The first birds had begun greeting the sunrise. Golden light slowly reached the tops of distant hills. Oversized hauling has a strange rhythm. One moment you're completely focused. The next, the road becomes peaceful again. I rolled the driver's window down another inch. Cool morning air drifted inside. The scent of damp earth mixed with fresh-cut hay. Those are the moments I remember most. Not the difficult turns, not the paperwork, not even the enormous load. I remember the quiet mornings, the empty highways, the first sunlight touching the mirrors, the feeling that the entire country was slowly waking up around me. The escort driver spoke again. We're making excellent time. How far to the state line? About 80 miles. I nodded. The hardest driving might have been behind us, but the journey itself was far from over. Beyond the next state waited long, open plains, strong crosswinds, and a bridge so narrow that every heavy-haul driver seemed to know it by name. I'd crossed it before, never with a load this wide, and as the morning sun climbed higher, I couldn't help wondering whether the bridge would feel as small as everyone claimed. By the time the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the convoy was already miles beyond the little town. Morning light spread gently across the plains, turning the fields a soft shade of gold. The flashing amber lights that had glowed so brightly during the night now seemed quieter, less dramatic, almost blending into the peaceful colors of the new day. I always enjoy that first hour after sunrise. The world feels unhurried. Coffee tastes a little better. The road seems to breathe a little slower. The Peterbilt settled comfortably into its steady pace. The engine no longer worked as hard as it had in the hills. Its familiar rumble became little more than a comforting background sound. The escort driver checked in over the radio. "Morning, morning. Sleepy yet?" I laughed softly, not with something this big behind me. I figured. The conversation faded as quickly as it had begun. That's another thing I appreciate about professional drivers. Nobody feels the need to fill every quiet moment with words. Sometimes silence is part of the job. Ahead, the highway stretched across open prairie. Straight, level, almost endless. The kind of road people imagine when they think of America. Fence posts disappeared toward the horizon. Windmills turned lazily in the distance. A freight train moved slowly across another valley several miles away. Everything seemed to be traveling somewhere. The load behind me remained perfectly steady. Even after hundreds of miles, it still amazed me. Its curved steel surface reflected the morning sunlight. For just a moment, it almost looked polished. The escort driver broke the silence once more. Bridge inspection point in 15 miles. I remember. Every oversized route includes places like that. Some bridges are crossed without a second thought. Others deserve a little more respect. This one belonged to the second group. It wasn't especially old, nor was it especially long. It was simply narrow. Narrow enough that ordinary tractor trailers usually stayed centered without thinking. With a load this wide, thinking was the entire job. Several miles before reaching it, warning signs began appearing. Oversized loads use caution. No passing on bridge. The escort vehicle increased the distance ahead. Its warning lights flashed steadily against the morning sky. Traffic was light. Only a handful of cars traveled in either direction. A state highway patrol vehicle waited near the bridge entrance. The officer stepped into the roadway, raising one hand. The few approaching cars slowed politely, then stopped. The bridge belonged to us now, at least for the next few minutes. I eased off the throttle. The Peterbilt rolled forward almost silently. From a distance, the bridge didn't look intimidating. Concrete rails, steel guard barriers, a small river flowing quietly beneath. Nothing unusual, yet appearances often deceive. The closer we came, the narrower it seemed. The escort driver's calm voice filled the cab. "You're perfectly lined up. I'll keep it that way. Nice and steady." I rested both hands lightly on the steering wheel. No sudden movements. No unnecessary corrections. Just smooth, deliberate steering. The front wheels reached the bridge first. Then the trailer followed. I glanced into the left mirror. Only inches separated the trailer from the concrete barrier. Then the right mirror. Almost exactly the same. The bridge seemed to hold its breath. Or perhaps I was holding mine. The river below sparkled in the morning sun. Fishermen stood quietly along one bank. One of them looked up as our convoy crossed overhead. I wondered what oversized loads looked like from down there. Probably slow, graceful, almost peaceful. Halfway across, the escort driver spoke again. "Looking perfect." Those two words carried more comfort than people might imagine. Experience teaches you to trust the people around you. An oversized haul is never completed by one driver alone. It's a team. Escort drivers, permit coordinators, mechanics, highway patrol, road crews. Every successful mile belongs to all of them. The final axle rolled off the bridge. The convoy continued forward without the slightest problem. I smiled to myself. Sometimes the obstacles we think about for hours pass quietly in a matter of seconds. The escort driver laughed over the CB. I guess everybody worried for nothing. That's usually the goal. The best oversized trips aren't remembered because something went wrong. They're remembered because everything went exactly as planned. The miles slipped by peacefully once again. The sun climbed higher. The air grew warmer. The highway carried us deeper into the wide, open plains. Somewhere ahead waited our final destination, a massive hydroelectric project that had taken years to build. Workers there were already expecting us. They had probably watched our progress every day, waiting for one final piece to arrive. The enormous steel housing behind me wasn't just another shipment anymore. It was the missing piece of something much larger, something that would eventually bring light to thousands of homes. That thought stayed with me for many quiet miles, because every truck driver learns the same lesson sooner or later. You rarely deliver something to its ending. Most of the time, you're delivering it to the beginning of someone else's story. And somehow, that's one of the most satisfying parts of the job. By early afternoon, the landscape began to change once again. The endless farmland slowly gave way to rolling hills. Far in the distance, enormous construction cranes reached into the sky. The escort driver noticed them before I did. "See those?" "I do. That's where we're headed." Even from 20 miles away, the construction site looked impressive. Tower cranes moved slowly against the blue sky. Large concrete structures stood unfinished beside a wide river. It was difficult to imagine how many years of work had already gone into the project. Thousands of people, millions of hours, countless truckloads. And today, we were bringing one more piece. The closer we came, the more traffic we began to see. Pickup trucks belonging to contractors, concrete mixers, flatbeds carrying steel beams, fuel trucks, service vehicles. Every road seemed to lead toward the same destination. I thought back to the little boy at the rest area. So someday, lights in somebody's house will work because you brought this? At the time, I'd smiled at the question. Now, looking at the enormous construction site ahead, it no longer sounded like something a child would say. It simply sounded true. The escort driver spoke again. "Construction entrance in 3 miles. "I've got it." Several workers were already waiting at the gate. Bright safety vests, hard hats, clipboards tucked beneath their arms. As our convoy approached, one of them raised a hand in greeting. The security gate rolled slowly open. Inside, the roads were much wider than ordinary streets. Everything had been designed for heavy equipment. Massive cranes rested on tracks wider than my truck. Bulldozers sat parked beside earth movers taller than houses. The scale of everything was remarkable. For the first time since picking up the load, our trailer no longer looked oversized. Here, everything was enormous. The convoy rolled slowly through the site. Workers stopped what they were doing for a moment. Some waved. Others simply watched us pass. One older gentleman stood quietly beside a concrete foundation. He removed his hard hat, looked up at the enormous turbine housing, and smiled. It wasn't excitement. It looked more like relief. We reached a large open area near the river. Several cranes already stood waiting. Their cables hung perfectly still in the afternoon air. A site supervisor climbed onto my running board. "You made excellent time. We had good weather. And good drivers," he replied with a smile. I appreciated that answer. Heavy haul trucking has taught me something over the years. People often praise the truck, or the engine, or the size of the load. But the real success usually belongs to the people working together. No one moves something like this alone. The supervisor pointed toward a painted area on the ground. "We'll set you right there." I eased the Peterbilt forward. One slow correction, then another. Finally, the escort driver lifted a hand. "Perfect." I applied the parking brake. The engine settled into a quiet idle. For a long moment, nobody hurried. There was no shouting, no rushing, only quiet conversations between crane operators, signal crews, rigging specialists. Everyone already knew exactly what needed to happen. Watching experienced people work together has always been strangely relaxing. Nobody wasted movement. Nobody raised their voice. Each person completed one small task. And somehow, those small tasks became something extraordinary. The massive lifting straps were connected one by one. Each shackle was inspected twice, each connection verified. Only then did the crane operator begin taking up the weight. The thick cables slowly tightened. The trailer suspension rose ever so slightly. For the first time since leaving the factory, the turbine housing no longer rested entirely on my trailer. It almost seemed reluctant to leave. Centimeter by centimeter, the enormous piece of steel lifted into the air. Nobody spoke. Hundreds of thousands of pounds floated silently above the ground. The cranes moved with surprising grace. Slowly, deliberately, almost gently, I stepped back beside the escort driver. We watched in silence. "You know," he said quietly, "we spend all our time getting things somewhere." I nodded. "And then, we usually never see what happens next." He was right. Truck drivers rarely witness the ending. We deliver, sign the paperwork, shake a few hands, then head toward the next pickup. But this time, we stayed. The turbine housing settled carefully onto its foundation. Workers immediately gathered around it, measuring, inspecting, smiling. One engineer looked toward us and gave a thumbs up. The supervisor walked over carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Thought you boys earned these." I accepted mine gratefully. The coffee was hot. The breeze coming off the river was cool. The afternoon sun reflected softly across the water. For several peaceful minutes, none of us said very much. Sometimes, a successful trip doesn't need many words. The paperwork was eventually signed. The escort vehicles prepared to leave. My trailer suddenly looked incredibly empty. After hundreds of miles behind me, the giant had finally reached its new home. I climbed back into the Peterbilt. The cab felt strangely quiet, almost lighter somehow. I looked once more through the mirrors. For the first time in days, there was nothing behind me except an empty trailer. It always feels a little strange after delivering a load. You spend so much time caring for it, that when it's gone, the road somehow feels different. I started the engine. The familiar diesel rumble filled the cab once again. The escort driver pulled alongside. "Heading home." I smiled. "A truck driver's home," I said, looking toward the highway beyond the construction site. "Is usually wherever the next road begins." He laughed, raised one hand in farewell, then turned toward the interstate. I followed a few moments later. The empty trailer rolled effortlessly behind me. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the highway. Another load would come, another destination, another quiet night somewhere beneath the stars. Because that's the beautiful thing about life on the road. Every delivery feels like the end of a story, and the beginning of another. The empty trailer felt almost weightless. Not literally, of course. Even without its cargo, it still weighed more than most people would ever imagine. But after spending days pulling something so enormous, everything seemed lighter. The steering felt easier. The engine climbed gentle hills without effort. Even the mirrors looked strangely empty. For the first hour after leaving the construction site, I kept glancing behind me. Each time, I expected to see that massive curved turbine housing. Rows of amber lights, endless chains, steel disappearing into the distance. Instead, there was only an empty deck. Funny how quickly you grow attached to a load. You spend enough miles watching it, checking it, protecting it. Eventually, it begins to feel like a quiet traveling companion. And then, one signature later, it's gone. The afternoon drifted peacefully toward evening. Golden sunlight stretched across the prairie. Long shadows crossed the highway. The traffic became lighter with every passing mile. I rolled the driver's window down a little farther. Warm spring air flowed into the cab. Fresh-cut grass. A distant hint of rain somewhere far away. The familiar scent of diesel whenever another truck passed. Some smells never leave a truck driver's memory. Even years later, one breath can take you back to a highway you haven't seen in decades. I thought about all the unusual things I'd hauled over the years. Wind turbine blades longer than football fields. Massive transformers. Old steam engines headed for museums. Pieces of bridges. Construction cranes. Mining equipment so large it traveled in several separate convoys. Every one of those loads looked impossible until someone figured out a way. That's one thing I've always admired about trucking. People see the finished result. A bridge, a hospital, a power station. Few ever stop to wonder how everything arrived there in the first place. The answer, more often than not, is simple. A truck, maybe several trucks, and drivers willing to spend long nights beneath unfamiliar skies. The afternoon slowly melted into evening. Clouds gathered along the western horizon. Soft gray ones. Nothing threatening. Just enough to hide the setting sun every few minutes. The changing light painted the Peterbilt's hood in warm shades of orange and gold. I smiled. Old trucks somehow look even better at sunset. Maybe because they've seen so many of them. The CB crackled quietly. The escort driver. Well, former escort driver now. How's the empty trailer treating you? It almost feels lonely. He laughed. I know exactly what you mean. You heading home? For a day or two. Then another oversized job. Of course. There was a short silence. You know, he finally said, most people will never understand why we enjoy this. I looked out through the windshield. The highway stretched toward another distant horizon. Fence posts, telephone poles, the white dashed line flowing endlessly beneath the truck. I don't think they need to. I answered. It's enough that we do. He wished me a safe trip. The radio fell quiet again. As evening settled across the plains, I began looking for a place to spend the night. Not because I was exhausted, simply because the day had reached its natural ending. One of my favorite truck stops appeared just before sunset. It wasn't the biggest, or the newest, but I'd stopped there enough times over the years that it almost felt familiar. The parking lot was already filling with trucks from every corner of the country. A shiny new Kenworth, an old Freightliner with faded paint, a classic Peterbilt polished until it reflected the sky. Every truck carried its own story. Every driver, another 1,000 miles of memories. I backed carefully into an open space, set the parking brake, switched off the engine. For a few moments, the only sound came from cooling metal quietly ticking beneath the hood. I've always loved that sound. It tells you the truck worked hard today. And now, both of you can rest. Inside the diner, the evening crowd was calm. A waitress greeted me with a familiar smile. Long day, the right kind. She nodded as though she understood perfectly. Maybe she did. Truck stop waitresses meet thousands of drivers. They learn to recognize the difference between tired and content. I ordered coffee, a simple hot meal, nothing fancy. The best meals on the road rarely are. At the counter, two older drivers were discussing weather somewhere out west. Another talked quietly with his dispatcher. Someone laughed near the jukebox. It all blended into the comfortable background music of life on the road. No hurry, no rush, just people between one destination and the next. Later that evening, I stepped back outside. The sky had turned completely dark. Stars slowly returned above the truck stop. One by one, parking lights switched off across the lot. Curtains closed inside sleeper cabs. Engines that had rumbled all day finally grew silent. The Peterbilt waited exactly where I'd left it. Tomorrow, it would pull another trailer, another load, another story. But tonight, there was nowhere else I needed to be. I climbed into the cab, closed the heavy door. The familiar quiet wrapped gently around me. I adjusted the small reading light, set tomorrow's route on the dashboard, placed my travel mug beside the bunk. Outside, a light breeze moved through the trees at the edge of the parking lot. Somewhere in the distance, a locomotive sounded its lonely horn. Another truck arrived long after dark. Its diesel engine idled for a few minutes before settling into silence. Those sounds have never kept me awake. Quite the opposite. To me, they've always sounded like home. I stretched out on the bunk. The mattress shifted softly beneath me. The cab still held a little warmth from the day's sunshine. I closed my eyes, and for one final moment, I pictured that enormous turbine housing, not on my trailer anymore, but standing beside the river, waiting patiently to become part of something that would outlive all of us. Maybe years from now, families would switch on lights without ever thinking about where the electricity began. Children would read books beneath those lights. Friends would gather for dinner. Someone would stay awake a little longer to finish a good story. And somewhere, hidden deep inside that great dam, would be one piece of steel that had once traveled quietly across the country behind an old Peterbilt, through sleeping towns, over narrow bridges, beneath endless stars. That thought made me smile. The road has a funny way of reminding you that even the smallest part of your journey can become part of someone else's future. Outside, the wind whispered gently between the parked trucks. Inside, everything was warm, still, quiet. Tomorrow, another road would be waiting. But tonight, the highway could rest, and so could I. That's where my story ends tonight. If you'd like to hear more from the road, hit subscribe and rest easy, my friend.